Easier ones of the session. We were supposed to have two hearings today, but State Fire Marshal got moved. So we have KBI, and we will start with our analyst, Kyle.
Good afternoon, committee. So some of you may have heard this budget during LBC. The summary has been changed quite a bit since then to simplify some of the numbers. And you should have also received two corresponding diagrams that may be a helpful referential point as we go through some of the reorganization-based numbers, especially with respect to the shift of the FTE positions in the reorganization process. Anyway, getting started, on the first page of the budget summary, you can see an overview of the fiscal year 2025 and 2026 requests. The fiscal year 2025 revised request is for $67.0 million, $52.3 million of which is SGF funded. The agency request in 2026 is for $158.4 million, $144.0 is SGF funded, and the LBC reduces the 2025 request to $66.96 million and $61.99 million respectively. Turning to page 2, in figure 3 on the budget comparison, I will make note that the spreadsheet equations on the table actually result in an uncorrectable error. They're built-in functional calculations for the total 2025 approved and agency changed approved. The approved value for 2025 should be $66,175,383 when you add those two numbers, instead of $66,205. And the agency approved change should be $811,835 when you add the SGF and all other funds number. The actual percentage change of 1.2% total is correct. Moving on to the table 4 analysis, the primary change for the budget request for fiscal year 2025 from the agency revision is a reorganization related change and an SGF reappropriation of the meth lab funds. And so item number 1 is $29,618 in SGF monies being reappropriated from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025. These are typically leftover meth lab funds. The agency is allotted $50,000 each year, and the number of meth labs differ year on, and the resulting cleanup fees associated with the variant number means that some years they have left over and some years they have more than $50,000 of cleanup fees. So they have typically attempted to reappropriate those monies forward. In the LBC, those reappropriation funds were removed, and the governor's recommendation re-adds that reappropriation. The fiscal year 2025 request does not have any supplemental additions. So item number 3 is a conversion of 13 off-budget positions to on-budget. And these are primarily being funded from additional vacancy funds for positions that already existed on the KBI budget. Item number 4 on page 3 is the reorganization that coincides with the two diagrams. The agency has collapsed the division system into two branch systems. This results in the Forensics Laboratory Division and Information Services Division becoming the new Criminal Justice Services Branch, and the Special Operations Division and Field Investigations Division becoming the Investigations Branch. There's some spillover of extraneous positions that move from each of those 4 divisions to the General Services and ks.gov JIS IT system positions, as opposed to directly into the 2 branch divisions. But for the most part, it's a collapse to combine similarly oriented divisions into a branch structure that removes some institutional barriers between the interactions of those organizations of similar function. And ultimately, that is an SGF neutral change and saves approximately $428,915 all funds. And the remaining, all other changes of $1.2 million is predominantly associated with contractual services and capital outlay related to the high-intensity drug trafficking administration related program. Expansion from fiscal year 2025. Are there any questions for fiscal year 2025?
Any questions for 25? Representative Resman.
Thank you, Mr. Street. When you first gave your presentation, you made a mention about, was it 66,000? You said there was an incorrect number? So on 66 million?
Yeah, so on figure 3, the bottom row of 2025 approved, the 66,205,001 should be 66,175,383. The bottom row, the total row for 2025 approved, instead of the listed $66,205,001 should be $66,175,300 or $175,383. And likewise, the total for agency change approved should be 811,835 instead of 782,217. 811,835 instead of 782,217.
Any further questions on 25? Let's go to 26.
So carrying on to page 5, the figure 6 is a summary of the changes for the budget for the 2026 request. The agency is requesting $158.4 million, 144.0 million SGF. And this is an increase of $92.2 million or 139%. All funds, and $91.8 million increase SGF or 175.8%. And breaking down the actual allotment more closely in figure 7, the table. The first item of request is for a new KBI headquarters facility. This is a $93 million SGF request to construct a new headquarters facility to replace the aging and security deficient current space, and also add ADA compliance and a fire suppression system for the facility. The LBC deleted this $93 million request as part of its deletion of all supplementals and enhancements. The second request is for laboratory infrastructure. This is a $1.2 million request that includes two subcomponents. The first is a $132,338 request for an increase to the salaries and wages of laboratory technicians to make the pay scale of lab technicians for the forensic science lab more competitive. And the second part of the request is a $1.1 million request of capital outlays for the purchase of replacement GCMS machines. That's a gas chromatography mass spectroscopy, and a GCMS machine, which is a tandem mass spec device in the quadruple time of flight specification. And those are for replacing aging instruments in the chemistry department of the forensics lab, and to provide a redundant quadruple time of flight instrument that's used for a secondary confirmation test, which is necessary for judicial purposes. As with the headquarters request, this request was deleted by the LBC, and the governor's request adds $500,000 of the equipment portion back, but not the salaries and wages increase portion. Item number 3 is a KBI security positions and wages request. This is a $1.1 million SGF and 2 FTE position request. The first portion of this is in coordination with the 2024 legislation for SB 291 that requires new cybersecurity officials. And so the 2 FTE positions and $355,363 in wages is for hiring a new Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Information Technology Officer pursuant to that legislation. The second part of the request is for $793,373 to increase the salaries and wages to be more competitive for the IT division within the KBI cybersecurity initiatives. As with the previous 2 enhancement requests, the LBC deleted this. The governor has added the salaries and wages and 2 FTE positions for the cybersecurity officials back into the budget, but not the salaries and wages increase portion. The fourth request is the cybersecurity storage area network systems. And this is a $526,000 SGF request for the replacement of 2 storage area network devices within the KBI network. And these are to replace aging systems that are no longer within their service usage life. That addition was also deleted by the LBC and not added back by the governor. Item number 5 is the offender registration compliance. This is the KBI offender registry system that is used by state law enforcement agencies, and the current system is out of date and not properly serving the agencies across the state, so they're looking to replace the system with the new Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act compliance system with $500,000 of SGF funds. The LBC deleted this request, but the governor's recommendation has added it back. The 6th request is the recruitment and retention of personnel through the payment progression plan. And this is a request of $239,626 SGF. For yearly salaries and wages increases related to the career progression plan. The KBI's career progression plan is not funded by outside sources like some of the other career progression plans within agencies, so there has to be a yearly request to actually accommodate the increases within the pay scale of those employees. This was not technically are considered a gray zone area in the LBC and has been left in until further determination of whether or not that was desired for deletion. And the last two items, 7 and 8, are the conversion of the 13 positions on to on budget and the reorganization related additions that are a result of the difference between the fiscal year 2025 revised request and the fiscal year 2025 approved request that the fiscal year 2026 request is associated to. And due to reductions of some one-time spends that were approved for fiscal year 2025 associated with the laboratory information management system and central messaging switch, the reorganization for 2026 has a reduction in spending of 4.4 million total and 4.8 million SGF. And for 2026, there are no further adjustments. Are there any questions for fiscal year 2026?
Any questions for the analyst on 26? All right, thank you, Kyle.
Would you like me to quickly cover the capital budget?
Please do.
So turning to page 10, the capital budget for fiscal year 2025 is a revised estimate of $4.6 million, including $3.4 million SGF. The first item is for the Great Bend HVAC system. And this was originally approved for 2024, but was delayed, and that's a $1.2 million request and $390,000 from the Forensic Materials Lab Fund and $850,000 ARPA funds. And item number 2 is 300,000 SGF for rehabilitation and repairs, and this is used for various upkeep of system security and HVAC systems within the forensics labs, facilities of the KBI, including the headquarters and other facilities that the KBI operates across the state. Moving to fiscal year 2026, this is a $96.4 million request, all SGF. This is predominantly due to the headquarters request of $93 million SGF for the new headquarters that was discussed in the first item of the 2026 enhancements. This was deleted by the LBC, and the last request is for again, 300,000 SGF for the rehabilitation and repair projects that may arise in fiscal year 2026. And the only change that the governor made to the LBC related recommendations for the capital budget is a request to lapse the debt service to shift the coverage of that debt service to the Department of Administration. Any questions on the capital budget?
Any questions on capital improvements? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Kyle. We will move on to Director Mativi. Thank you for joining us, Director.
Thank you. Is that better? Okay. Hello to many of my old friends, and welcome to some of my new friends. Thank you for the opportunity to address our budget for 2026. I'm going to start, Kyle did a great job. I'm going to back up and start over and talk with you a little bit about the reorganization. From our perspective, that was completely budget neutral. When I took this job 2 years ago, I've inherited an organizational structure that was, I'm sure, very comfortable for my predecessor, but it was overwhelming for me. I had 12 direct reports. We had 2 assistant directors and then a number of department heads, all of whom reported directly to me. And that just, 12 was too big a span of control for me. So I set about to try to narrow that span of control. And basically what we did was we combined our two investigative units, field investigations and special operations. We combined them into an investigative branch and put one assistant director in charge of that. The rest of the agency, we separated into an inward-facing and an outward-facing. The outward-facing is where our customer was someone or some agency outside of the organization, okay? So our lab fell under that umbrella, the fusion center, things like that. Put one assistant director in charge of that. And so as a result, none of those department heads answered directly to me anymore. They all answered to the assistant director, right? And then the inward-facing part of the organization is where the customer was a KBI employee. So things like wellness, recruiting, training, things like that went into what we call the administrative branch. And I have an assistant director there who reports to me, but all of the department heads report to him, right? So I took my span of control and shrunk it from 12 direct reports down to 6. Now, I'm glad to hear that from a budget perspective, that saved us almost $500,000. That's not the way we looked at it, right? We just looked at it as eliminating institutional barriers to communication and giving the new director a much more comfortable span of control. That's what it was about. So the reorg, I think, sounds a lot more complicated from a budgetary perspective, or when you look at it from a budgetary perspective, it may be complicated. From my perspective, trying to lead an organization with almost 400 employees, it was just a matter of having more effective lines of communication is all that it was about. So from our perspective, it was budget neutral. It didn't result in any additions or subtractions of FTEs, enhancements, anything like that. So I hope, and from our perspective, that's depicted better on this chart, where you see basically just two, at the top left, Information Services Division and Forensic Science Laboratory are combined into the Criminal Justice Services branch. And then on the upper right, Special Operations Division and Field Investigations Division are just combined into an investigations branch. So I know this is a lot simpler. It's more compelling to a simple mind like mine. The budget folks, I'm sure, need a lot more arrows and dots and dashes and things to understand it. But from an organizational perspective, it was a very simple move. To talk now about our 2026 budget, the main thing on that budget, as you've heard, is our new headquarters. We desperately need a new headquarters building. The building that we're in is beautiful and it's historic, but it's originally a middle school that was built well before our agency was even created. In the process of trying to figure out what to do with it and whether we could fix it, we came across an appraisal from 1996, and the architects in 1996 referred to it as functionally obsolete, almost 30 years ago. So since then, we have continued to do the best we could with what we have. We have tried to modify the space to suit our needs. We have crumbling concrete, we have decaying pipes, but the main thing that I want to convey to you is that it is simply not a safe environment for our people to work in. And it's not safe for two different reasons. Number one, we have filled it in such a way that it was never intended to be filled. For example, on the 4th floor, which was never intended for human occupancy, it was only intended when it was constructed for storage. We now have human beings up there on the 4th floor. They're working in what is primarily wood construction in a place where much of our HVAC and electrical equipment is located with no fire suppression because the building can't accommodate it. So not only is that not up to code, but it's just not safe. In addition, we're located in an area where we have no physical perimeter to provide our employees a safe ingress and egress from the building. Our campus, if you will, which is 2 buildings, straddles an alley in Topeka, and it's not uncommon for us to have employees who are either walking in to work or walking out of work being accosted by homeless folks and drug addicts. And I know I've gotten a little bit of pushback for being as frank as I've been about our neighborhood. That offended some people, and I'm sorry for that. I didn't mean to offend anybody. But if you look at the crime stats for our neighborhood, just in the last year, in a 2-block radius of the KBI, there have been 51 reports to the Topeka Police Department of crimes ranging from burglary of a vehicle and vandalism all the way up to aggravated burglary within 2 blocks of our headquarters in the last year. For us to have folks coming in and out of the building with no physical perimeter is just not a safe environment. And I also got a little pushback about, well, how is it that you're so worried about KBI agents walking in and out of the building? That's really not the work that happens in that building, right? That's where our Information Services Division is located. That's where our Administrative Division is located. I'm not worried one bit about our agents not being safe. I am worried about providing a safe environment for our administrative personnel, our clerks who might be new mothers, who might be we have one person who's a brand new mom who under our maternity policy is bringing her son to work 2 days a week for the next 6 months, which we not just allow, but encourage, and we're not giving her a safe environment in which to do that. So both from a structural perspective and a physical security perspective, the building isn't safe. Now, what we put in our budget was a request for a new building. It doesn't matter to me how we get that, right? What we put in was what we thought at the time was the cost of a new building. We have been encouraged by some folks in the legislature and some folks in state government to look at alternative methods of getting there. And I'm delighted to do that. I think I kind of specialize in looking at creative solutions to problems. And one of the things that we found with the headquarters building is we could easily do a 30-year lease. If the state doesn't want to be the landlord or the building owner, there are developers out there who not only we've talked to developers who will not only put us on a particular piece of ground, we've looked at a number of sites that are available, that are acceptable, that we would welcome. They could put us on a particular piece of ground, they could build the building, they could maintain the building for us. We certainly have folks that we can work with that would do a 30-year lease, even with a purchase at the end, or if we don't want to lock the state in because we don't know what the budget is going to look like in 30 years, we can do a 30-year lease with an option to buy at the end. And that way, if we get to the end and the state doesn't want to buy, they're not locked in, but if they do, there's a provision for that. So there are developers out there, we know that we can work with them to come up with a creative way to do this that doesn't involve spending $100 million-ish of state general funds. We're prepared to talk about those solutions. We're eager to talk about those solutions. In addition, we are presenting legislation this session that produces a possible funding stream. We don't know how much that might bring in, but let me tell you a little bit about the legislation. Our sister state to the south, Oklahoma, recognized that the cartel was funding their operations, at least in part, through the use of wire transfers from the United States to Mexico and Central America. Oklahoma implemented a wire transfer fee, putting a fee on wire transfers, collecting that money back and generating millions of dollars a year from what we know to be a funding mechanism going to the cartels. They tax the cartels, if you will. It doesn't impact legitimate businesses because any legitimate business that uses a wire transfer, not used by a lot of businesses. We're not talking about banks. Banks are excluded. We're talking about MoneyGram, Western Union, things like that. If a legitimate business sends one, they get a tax credit at the end of the year. So it's zero fiscal impact on a legitimate business that's using that money transmission method. That is a revenue stream. We don't know what it would bring in here. We know that in Oklahoma, and we have modeled our proposed legislation on Oklahoma's, we know that they bring in between $8 and $10 million a year. We know that the lease on a new headquarters for the KBI would be probably in the neighborhood of $9 million a year. So I know this is a big ask. I'm not standing here lightly making this ask. I'm standing here because I believe that I, as an agency head, have failed in giving my employees a safe work environment. And I'm asking for your help fixing that. And I'm asking that you help me get creative and figure out a way to do it, because I agree that taking that money right out of state general funds at the outset is not the way to do it. But I believe if we work together, if we can get this in the budget, if we can start the discussions, we can come up with a creative way to do this. And that's what I'm asking for your help with. Other than that very big ask, I would just ask the legislature to agree with the governor's recommendations. And at that point, there's nothing else that the KBI is asking you for other than a new headquarters and working with us to come up with a way to fund it that doesn't take it out of state general funds. So I'm happy to talk with you about what the governor agreed to fund. I think there's some important and worthwhile projects there. It wasn't everything that we asked for, and I recognize that. And you know what the governor didn't recommend, I think, pales in comparison to our need for a new headquarters. And that's why I'm willing to just shove that to the side and let's focus this discussion on the headquarters, because the need is very real and very desperate. So, Mr. Chair, I'll look to you for direction. If you'd like to talk about governor's recs, I'm happy to do it. If you'd rather I just stood for questions, I'm happy to do that as well.
Well, thank you for your presentation. Yeah, if you don't mind touching on kind of what the governor did recommend. And
The first thing, and perhaps the most important thing, is the career progression plan. Many of you have heard me talk about the difficulties that we have had recruiting and retaining agents. We, I believe, thanks in large part to your help and the fact that last year you gave us the funding that allowed us to do a roughly 25% across the board pay raise for agents. We are very close now to being fully staffed with agent personnel. But in order to keep up, we have to have that career progression plan. And when that plan was implemented, it wasn't funded. And as a result, we have to come back every year and ask for funding to continue the career progression plan. And that's what the first governor recommendation was just continue the career progression plan and fund it. One of the things I found when I started is that we are not on a frequent enough replacement cycle for our lab equipment. If you've ever been to the KBI lab on the Washburn University campus, it's an amazing place filled with incredible, smart, hardworking people. But we weren't replacing the very expensive scientific equipment in that lab frequently enough. And we have very complicated machines like gas chromatograph, mass spectrometers that are worth $250,000 or $300,000 that have exceeded their useful life. So not only are they out of warranty, but they're actually working beyond what the manufacturer says they're capable of doing. Our lab works very hard to keep those machines online and functioning, but we need to replace those more often. We had asked for just over $1 million to do that. Governor recommended $500,000, which that'll let us get the job done. Let me take a look at the others. Cybersecurity. The Senate bill last year, I can never remember the number, and I'm not sure why. I can remember my phone number from when I was growing up as a child, but I can't remember the number for that Senate bill last year, 291. It required us to add a CISO and a CETO, but didn't give us funding for that. And I remember the discussion at the time was, well, we'll come back in a subsequent session and fund those. So she did recommend funding those two positions, and that is very helpful. And then the last area is what we call K-sort, and that's the Kansas Sex Offender Registration System. One of the things that I found when I started this job is we have a platform for registering and tracking offenders, whether they're sex offenders, violent crime offenders, or drug offenders, that's just inadequate. And we heard from a lot of sheriffs across the state that we're not giving them the tools that they need to do that. So we spent about 18 months drilling down and trying to figure out what's the best way to do offender registration. And we sent a team across the country and we looked at how other states do this. And what we came to the realization, number one, that we were doing an awful job of supporting our sheriffs. We need a different way of doing it. And we think the way to do it is with a third-party platform that's deployed on a statewide basis. Right now, some of the sheriffs who can afford it are paying out of their budget for a third-party platform. We, in my view, have just as much an obligation to those smaller rural sheriff's departments that can't afford it as we do to the sheriff's departments that can afford it. And that's why I'm pushing for a statewide implementation of a new platform. The governor funded that to the tune of $500,000. We think that's what it's going to take. This, to be clear, doesn't benefit the KBI. This is a benefit to all of the sheriffs across the state. And it's a way that I think we've let them down. And we appreciate the support in being able to do a statewide deployment of an independent third-party platform. So that's what the governor recommended. Anything that was in our original request that she didn't recommend, like I said, I think all of that pales in comparison to our need for this new headquarters. So we're not even asking for anything that's not in the governor's recs, and we want to focus the discussion on the building.
Any questions for the director? Representative Resman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Mativi, thanks for being here today. Your career progression plan, does it include forensic scientists
Yes, sir.
and pay?
It includes pay for agents and forensic scientists, but only those, right? Those are the only categories of KBI employees that are included right now in the career progression plan. Let me just, it's like the game show where you ask a friend, am I right? Okay. The budget expert says, yes, I got that one right.
Well, as you know, I retired from the sheriff's office in Johnson County, and for 10 years I was on the hiring board. And whenever we had an opening in our lab, we would hire people from the KBI because we paid more.
Right.
So I think the progression plan is probably pretty important to keep, because now I'm on this side of the fence and I want to keep employees here in the state of Kansas and not have them go work for somewhere else. You know, they can go look elsewhere for their employees now.
So I know you'll understand this well, Representative Russman. When it comes to agents, our problem is recruiting. And it's because we don't pay them enough to make it attractive for them to leave their current agency and come to us. You all helped us tremendously last year with that enhancement that let us do 25% across the board. That enhancement, our class 2 years ago was 12 agents. Last year, I think because of that 25% raise, it was 18. And that's why we're so close to being full staffed. Our problem with scientists is different. It's with retention. And that's because it takes about a year and about $250,000 to train a scientist. And as soon as that happens, as soon as they're done, they're far more valuable to the private sector than we can pay them for, or to those guys in Johnson County who can pay them more as well. So our challenge with the chemists and the other scientists is holding on to them.
I have one more question. On your headquarters concerns,
Yes, sir.
I noticed down here at the bottom, you said that the plumbing in the building is 100 years old.
Yes, sir.
Has that been tested for lead?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. Can I ask Paul to answer? Would that be okay, Mr. Chair? Tested for lead. He doesn't know the answer to that either. I can tell you one of our biggest concerns is there is nowhere in that building to store agent evidence where we are not at risk of a pipe break flooding the evidence room. And as you can imagine, the ramifications of that would be severe. In any sort of new construction, agent evidence is not going to be anywhere that it can be drowned or burn up, right? And so that's just one of the challenges we face in this old construction is there's nowhere else to put it. And if one of those pipes breaks, we have the potential for a real problem.
I just thought about lead and the safety of the people that have to drink the water there, that's all.
Representative Howell.
Thank you, Chair. I am new to this committee, as you may realize. So I am looking this over, and I understand the challenges that you're facing as far as your headquarters. 93 million is a lot of money. However, it's quite substantial for any building. Are you intending to move the lab away from Washburn?
No.
If you did that?
No, the lab is our newest facility. It's modern, it's up to date, it's a flagship. All of this discussion is for administrative and operational space that's separate from the lab. The lab would stay right where it's at on Washburn. And I understand it's a lot of money. You know, when we first started this discussion, we talked about partnering with the Highway Patrol and seeking approval to do a joint headquarters building with Highway Patrol. We have a lot of overlap. I think there's the opportunity to save some money there. The colonel is behind that idea. I remain behind that idea, but they work in a different part of the state, in a different part of state government, not geographically different. We're all covering the same 88,000 square miles, but you know, they answer to a different chain of command, and it was made clear that there's arrangements being made for them to go one place, and so we're on our own. I think the tremendous for savings by cooperation and collaboration still exists. We're willing to explore it, but absent that, you know, it's a lot of money, but there are just things that we need that are expensive. We need agent evidence storage. We need training space. Right now, when we put on a class of new agents, we don't have a place to train them. We have to borrow training space from other agencies. We don't have a firing range. You know, there's a lot of stuff that's really expensive that we don't have that we need in order to efficiently do the very important work that gets done in that building.
So, forgive my ignorance, how many classes of KBI agents do you have a year?
One a year.
One a year.
We have a total FTE allocation of about 112 agents. We've talked about what our sweet spot is so we don't have an external training department because of the size of our agency. For the most part, when a new class comes in, we pull agents to teach them, right? We're not big enough to justify a freestanding training department other than the guy that runs the training program and some support staff. We've talked about, until we get full staffed, would we be smart to add on another class per year? And what I think the consensus in the organization is, that's pulling agents away from their case responsibilities too much to justify. So we talk about this on a regular basis. What's our sweet spot? How big do we need to be before we have a training department? What size would we be ready to add a second class? Right now, we're at one class a year, and we think that's the right way to do it.
I'll just comment, I would love to meet with you or a staff member some more about this and learn more about this. Thank you.
There are a few things, about the only thing I like more about talking about and bragging about the KBI is talking about and bragging about my kids. So I would be happy to come over and talk to you and brag about the KBI.
Representative Bloom.
Thank you, Chairman Anderson. Sir, how much money, do you have any idea that the money orders would bring in?
No, we know what it brings in Oklahoma. And that's more than enough than it would bring in to cover the cost of a lease of the size of building that we're contemplating here. Last year we brought it up and the bankers objected. We've worked with them in the off session. We don't have any intention of impacting the banking industry. We think we've written a bill that doesn't. It's just hard to say how much it's going to bring in until we get it started. I will mention, Mr. Chair and other members of the committee, we did have a discussion yesterday where one of the things that Representative Waymaster asked us to consider was whether there's ARPA funding out there that has to be spent by the end of '25 that could be earmarked for this project, and whether that is something that we could do, something we could use to do a down payment on this building and buy down the cost going forward of any lease. Again, that's one of those creative solutions that if that's out there and we can use it for this, I'd love to find a way for us to work together to make that happen.
You know, if you're keeping the whole state safe, $93 million isn't that much. $1 million isn't much.
Well,
I think you should, have it, if it's your family, our state, you're the guys keeping us safe. If that's what it costs, I think we ought to find some way to do it.
Well, I appreciate that, Representative. Thank you. I will tell you that we began last night doing a survey on social media just to get some opinion, some public opinion about this kind of a project. And one of the things that we found is, yes, people are concerned about their taxes, but if there's a way to make this tax neutral, then a project of this kind has overwhelming support. And I'm talking numbers upward of 80%. I think the public recognizes how important the work is that we do, how important it is to them, and how important it is to their community. And they realize that we need to be able to do it efficiently. And that's what this request is about as well. Not just safety, but efficiency too.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. We know each other's background pretty good. One of the things that I read in here and that you were talking about, well, it's actually two things. The new forensic center over on Washburn, do they not have capacity to store evidence there?
It's not a
from the different agents bringing stuff in?
So they do store evidence over there on a short-term basis, but under the accreditation standards, evidence that goes in there gets processed and sent back out. So the storage that happens in the lab is very short-term, and it's for the specific purpose of accommodating testing, right? The agent, what we call agent evidence, that's long-term storage of the evidence for the purpose of prosecution, post-litigation proceedings, and things like that. It's not a capacity issue for that not to be at the lab, it's an accreditation issue. We can't keep that sort of long-term evidence in that lab facility if we want to keep them accredited. And it's very important to us that they be accredited. And I think it's important to the state that our flagship forensic laboratory be an accredited laboratory.
I lost my train of thought. I don't know if you know this or not, maybe somebody here, because one of the options that you put on this was the old state hospital grounds. Do you know if the state still owns any of that land out there?
So we've looked at a handful of sites around Topeka. You know, we haven't looked outside of Topeka. I mean, I see this as a very different request if we're asking to move, which we're not. We're asking to stay right here in the state capitol. Of the sites that we have looked at, 2 of them are over on the state hospital grounds, but they are owned by USD 501. Now, 501 has expressed a willingness and in fact even an eagerness to work with us. They want to make that land available to us if we want it, and those are good sites. So we certainly wouldn't turn our noses up at them. But your question is whether they're owned by the state, and they're not. We've also looked at a piece of ground that's owned by a developer. When the site assessment was done, that was rated as a desirable site for us, but they thought we were going to have to work hard to get it. And in fact, the developer has come to us and said, we'd really like to have you here. So we've got some options as far as site selection. And all of this discussion is assuming that we go new. I mean, we certainly are willing to look at renovation to suit if that's available. We've looked around, we haven't seen anything in Topeka, but I'm not a commercial realtor. I mean, if somebody approaches us with a situation where we could renovate to suit, we would be more than willing to talk with them and figure out if there's a way to make that work. What we do know is that our current building, just bringing that up to code would be $86 million, just to get it to code. So if that's your baseline, that 93 becomes a lot smaller number, right?
I have just one more question, quick question, and it goes back to the forensic science building there. You said that some of the equipment that's being used there is 20-some years old. Did they not, when they built that building and the KBI entered that, did they not get new equipment for their forensics labs?
So
Because you're looking at probably not even 10 years.
Right, it's about an 8-year-old facility. And I don't remember using the number 20. I do know that some of the equipment was moved over, some of it was bought new. I know that the life expectancy on some of those machines is 10 to 12. I know that we've exceeded the life expectancy on some of them. I don't know that we have any as old as 20. I don't remember saying that number, and I can find out for you if that is true. The vast majority of equipment in that lab was purchased new in 2016. But again, we have to get on a frequent replacement cycle for it, or we're going to find ourselves behind the power curve pretty quickly. And we do have equipment that has exceeded its life expectancy that we're still using because the folks in our lab are really good at keeping it up and running, and they work really hard to do that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. A question concerning the possible new legislation with respect to the fee, if you will, for those funds that are wire transferred back to Mexico. What mechanism are we using to be certain that that we're not putting an additional burden on, for instance, those businesses that operate here legally and they simply buy products from Mexico? Is this just for businesses? What about those individual families that they have people that are employed here, however they send their, by wire transfer, money back home to take care of their families there? I'm just curious, what's the mechanism in which we differentiate between that which might be cartel money versus that would just be legit? Is it a dollar amount, or what are we doing?
So what we envision is a percentage, whether it's 1% or 2%. There's no question that this puts a burden on the people that are sending the wire transfers. But if it is a legitimate entity that sends that wire transfer, meaning they have an EIN or they have a social security number, then at the end of the year, they file for a tax credit and they get that fee refunded in the form of a tax credit. So we are putting a burden on them. There's no question about it. They have to keep track of the expenses, and at the end of the year, they have to file for their tax credit. But we're not putting a financial burden on those legitimate entities, whether they're individuals or businesses, because they can get a credit equal to the amount that they spent on the fees. But the cartels don't have an EIN, and they don't have a social, and those are the ones that bear the financial brunt of this fee. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does work as an explanation. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Director, is that going through financial institutions?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, Bob had to leave for another meeting. I think it was going through financial institutions, but I can get back to you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Delberde.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, sir.
KHP currently has a pretty decent training facility in Salina. Is there any talk of maybe for training purposes taking part of that campus?
We have talked about that.
Okay, is it feasible or?
Potentially.
Okay.
One of the things that I've enjoyed so much about this job is having the colonel come in at about the same time. And I think one of the things that you'll find is that we're cooperating and collaborating on things that our organizations, even though they've always had a very good relationship, we're still doing more together than has ever been done. And I think that's because the colonel and I we know that that's the right thing to do for the state. And I'll give you an example. I had talked about purchasing a rapid DNA machine, not for use in law enforcement purposes necessarily, but they're very helpful in disasters. So for example, in whether it's the California wildfires or the fires in Hawaii, rapid DNA machine was how most of those victims, the badly burned victims, were identified. That's an expensive machine. When I mentioned to the colonel the idea that I had talked with my colleague in Colorado about the idea of each of our agencies going in and together and buying one of those machines, and the first words out of Eric's mouth, and I never expected this to even come up. He said, well, how big is that? And I said, about the size of a file box. And he said, so we could keep that in the hangar in Hayes, and whenever it was needed anywhere in either state, we can just put it on a KHP plane and fly it there. And I said, yeah, we sure could. I mean, what a great way for our two agencies to cooperate. I didn't even think of it, but when I mentioned the idea of a rapid DNA machine for disaster response, his first comment was, how can we help you do that? So I would say, Representative, everything is on the table. And if they get their training facility and are willing to give us space in it, Representative Howell, that's something that we can take out of that $93 million. We'd be more than happy to look at that and figure out a way to make it work.
And the other part of that is, I've already talked with Eric concerning where they're wanting to move. If we took the training element out of this, would there be space in that building for you guys to join them?
Where they're going now?
Where it's Curtis Building, where they're wanting to go.
No,
And
there's
I
not
don't know
enough
how
room
much
for us in
space is there.
Curtis. So my understanding is that there's 60,000 square, I'm speaking a little bit out of school here because I'm not really involved in these discussions, but my understanding of them is they are going into Curtis to fill a void that's being created by Commerce moving over to docking.
That's correct.
And they only need about 60,000 because their operations are spread throughout the state. Our administrative needs are focused here in Topeka. We need about twice that amount of space. We need about 120 total. So if we were to go in together with KHP, we'd be looking at probably 150, 160-ish as a joint headquarters.
And that's a good perspective I did not have. So, because I think what they're wanting to do, in my mind, makes perfect sense, getting them out of rented space and into a state building. So, okay, thank you.
Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know there have been capital outlay studies for highway patrol. Did KBI do a capital outlay study that combined the site assessments and funding options? I'm wondering if there's more information that combines all of these different options.
We have two different needs assessments that I think is what it's maybe a different term. We're calling it something different, but I think it's the same thing. So we had a statewide needs assessment done by PGAV Architects, and they looked not only at headquarters, but they looked at all 8 of our locations around the state. Great Bend, Garden City, Wichita, Pittsburgh, Topeka, both locations in Topeka, both locations in the KC metro area. And they said, on a statewide, sort of a global basis, here's what we think KBI needs. In addition to that, within the last year, we've had a needs assessment done by HTK Architects, and they looked just at the headquarters project. And they looked at what does KHP need, what does KBI need, and what would they both need if they would go in together. And so we would be happy to share either or both of those documents with you or with anyone else in the legislature who'd like to see them. It's comprehensive. There's a lot of data there.
Thank you. That would be, I would be interested to see that, and then because what I'm looking for then, I mean, I think you're convincing at least me of the need, but then like where do we go from there? Options of where the buildings could go, how the funding mechanisms just combined, that would be.
They're fascinating documents because among other things, I mean, they look at what do we have now, where do we have it, what kind of people, what sorts of job categories do we have working in those spaces, how have the needs changed from when we put them in those spaces to now, what's a more efficient way to use them, how do we take into account remote workers, how do we hotel people, things like that. And then they came up with square footage requirements, and then they looked at sites, and then they looked at how those square footage requirements would fit on those various sites. And all of that is in the needs assessment. And as I said, we'll get a copy of that over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And then just one more comment to hear about the options for new parents, new moms, to be able to have children come with them to work in that time, I think is an excellent policy. So thank you for sharing that information with us.
Well, I appreciate that. I love that we do that. I mean, I love that our new moms get to, for a several-month period, bring their kids in. I like seeing them around. I enjoy a little baby therapy every now and again, but I think the moms get a lot out of it. And I think the other employees get a lot out of seeing their coworkers, a coworker there with their new child. So I'm really glad we do it too.
Representative Howell.
Thank you, Chair. So just looking at this document and from the conversation, so am I understanding correctly, you are statutorily required to be in the Topeka area? The building headquarters is required to be in the Topeka area?
I don't know if we're statutorily required to or not. There's a lot of head shaking behind me. I'm not aware of a statutory requirement. When our desire for a new headquarters became public, we were approached by a developer here in Topeka. I've been approached by a number of developers, 2 of them in Lawrence. Again, I view it as a very different request if I'm asking to move headquarters than if I'm just asking for a better, more efficient, and safer facility in the same place. But I'm not aware of a statutory requirement that tethers us to Topeka.
Representative Delberdang.
Thank you for the second time around. So you had mentioned, and maybe you brought it up while I stepped out of the room for a little bit, but as far as leasing, do you have any documentation of what that would cost? Has there been any study or anything on that?
Yeah, so we, as I mentioned, we've talked to developers. There have been folks who've approached us about the project. I'm told that there's an industry standard where you take the value of the building and a lease should be about 8% per year of that total value with a slight inflationary escalator, right? So you start out, if it's a $100 million building, then 8% of that is your first year lease over the term of the lease. So, I mean, everybody knows it's the difference between buying and renting, right? You're going to pay more over the long term if you're making payments. But if our concern today is the budget today, and we don't have the money to spend on that building, we do have the option, and we know what the numbers look like.
And I'm intrigued because that percentage that would come out to 7.2, 7.3 million, I believe, per year. So it shows some flexibility on how to get through this. So I appreciate that part of it. And when we built the new Lansing prison building, that was on a lease, was it not? Do you remember? And I think it had like a $1 buyout or so after so much time. So that'd be a perspective there that after so many years to do a cheap buyout of the thing then. So
I think at the end of the term, having the option is what I would recommend, because we don't know as we stand here today. I don't know if we want to bind the state to buying it or if we want to bind the state to not buying it. I think it's important at the end to have an option would be, for what it's worth, sir, respectfully, my suggestion.
thank you.
Well, I think we've grilled you enough for one day, so I appreciate you stopping by, Director.
Pretty easy, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all. Thank you to all the committee members. Appreciate and happy to follow up with you anytime you like.
Thanks. All right, well, that closes our budget hearing on KBI. If there's no comments for the committee, we are adjourned.